A reading from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verses 30 to 34 and 53 to 56. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going, they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout that whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages, towns, or countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. The word of God for the people of God.
I think Victoria always takes a sip of water. I'll see if it'll help me preach better. Magic. Grace and peace to all of you. It's a privilege to be here in my home church this morning to bring the word from the gospel. I'm grateful that you all claim me, at least most of the time. I welcome the opportunity to worship here regularly. We are smack dab in the middle of summer. Thank you for being here. And our lectionary text beckons us to think about Sabbath. And that I am preaching today confirms that Pastor Victoria is practicing Sabbath. The Gospel of Mark is the hurry up gospel. You hear one word over and over and over. Euthus is the Greek word. It means immediately. And immediately he went here, he went there. And scene upon scene, they're stacked up. He's teaching, he's healing, he's interrupted. Those are called Markan sandwiches. On the way to do one thing, he's interrupted to do another thing immediately. The schedule had been hectic, and the 6th chapter of Mark records the sending out of the disciples, the death of John the Baptist, a strenuous preaching load, and then the reporting by the apostles. They had been sent out as fledglings for the first time without the master. And the press of the people meant they didn't even have time to eat. And then Jesus says to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." And they departed by boat into a solitary place. We don't know how long the respite lasted, and soon the crowd is on their heels once again. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is inviting the disciples to the same kind of rhythm that he practiced. He knew he had to get away from the crowds. He went to the lonely places to pray, to get perspective. He knew this was essential if he was going to be faithful to his calling. In one scene that I'll not preach from today, when the crowds had found him, they stayed all day. not even packing a lunch. But that's a sermon for another day. Well, once again, he urges the disciples, get in the boat, go on ahead, as he dismissed the crowd. And then he goes up the mountain by himself to pray. He seems to know what is required in order to continue his vocation. Dorothy Bass, who's a wonderful scholar, has written a little book on Sabbath called Receive the Day. She says it's a gift just waiting to be unwrapped. And it tells us about how we should use time, because it makes all the difference that we use it in terms of how we deal with our innermost selves, with other people, with the world, and yes, coram Deo, before God. Time is the great gift that God offers, and time is where God meets us. Even the attempt to draw near to God is met by embrace, even if we wish God would speak up a little bit more when we attempt to do that. I'm going to teach you another Greek word. You can apply this toward 15 minutes toward your MDiv at United Seminary, okay, for enduring these two. The first one was euthus, immediately. The second word is eremos, which means a lonely, a solitary, a desolate. It also can mean a dangerous place. Why would Jesus invite them to a dangerous place? It's because it's a place of vulnerability. It's a place where no longer is one contending with the eye or the ear, but simply with the matter of the heart, where one opens oneself to holy presence. Listening for God requires practice, and it requires time. That's part of Sabbath. Now, Sabbath used to refer only to the day of worship. In my childhood, we talked about observing the Sabbath. And some would prefer to keep that as its primary meaning. And yet, I want to expand the word to mean any time we can manage to set apart for nourishing our deepest self. Practicing Sabbath is a profound act of humility, for it acknowledges that God and others can keep things going even in our absence. An act of humility. As the poet Wendell Berry puts it, the field has been tilled and left to grace. He had done what he could do, and he depended upon God to accomplish the harvest. To act as if the world cannot get along without our work for just a bit is a startling display of pride that denies the sufficiency of our generous Maker. Refraining from work on a regular basis should teach us not to demand excessive labor on the part of others. Sometimes we who drive ourselves so hard are relentless with those around us. When I took my first sabbatical as a young professor, many years ago, I was really not sure the seminary could make it in my absence. Who would tend to my students? Who would stir things up in faculty meeting? Who would keep pressing for full inclusion of women in ministry? This tells you this was a while back in Baptist circles. Well, the school survived during my sabbatical, and the time away allowed me to write my first book after doing the dissertation. It also taught me the notion of indispensability is a myth. Sabbath is hard for us to cultivate, quite actually. But we must develop some new forms that make sense within the complicated circumstances of our lives. Perhaps we can adapt some of the traditions of others. And I will mention how the Jews keep Shabbat. A few years ago, I was on a study leave in Jerusalem, and part of the experience was to attend a Shabbat dinner in an Orthodox household. Now, the onset of Shabbat in Jerusalem is a lovely bustle as people go and get flowers and do last-minute grocery shopping and hurry home before sundown, of course. My colleague and I were driven near to the synagogue in the neighborhood where we would go to worship with our hosts, and we walked the rest of the way as traffic barricades were being put up to the neighborhood. Nobody was going to drive there over that evening, nor until sundown the next day. And then the peace descended. Walk slowed. Talk softened. It was a quiet, leisurely time. After worship, we walked to the home of my hosts for a lovely meal, not hurried. One of the best parts of the evening was the blessing of the children, when you gather the kids up and put hands on their heads and say a word of grace and appreciation for them, and then send them off to bed. And I see why the ancient saying lingers. More than the Jews have kept the Sabbath, Sabbath has kept the Jews. More than the Jews have kept the Sabbath, Sabbath has kept the Jews. And so our question this morning is, what is keeping us? Sabbath is more than vacation, although I highly recommend that we take the days our employers offer. Sometimes people return from a vacation more tired than when they took off because they didn't build in Sabbath into their time away. So how do we begin to cultivate this good practice? Well, I have a few suggestions, and probably you can add to the list. Reading that draws us to reflect on the sacredness of life. Rick, don't tell Victoria, but while I was in her office this morning, I was looking at what she's reading, of course. I didn't pilfer, but I observed. Reading that nourishes the heart. Walking that awakens us to the grandeur of creation. Hosting a meal, setting an extra plate on the dinner table. That this family in Jerusalem was willing to have two rank strangers come to their home was a great expression of hospitality. How about refusing to feel guilty for taking a nap? I need to cultivate that more myself. How about finding a way to incorporate blessing others into our rhythms? Saying the good word, noticing, affirming, being kind. Worshiping regularly in congregational life nourishes the heart, awakens us. And of course, conversing with God is a place to practice Sabbath. The Benedictines like to say, without prayer, our energy for life runs down. I think they are correct. Without this ongoing conversation. Coram Deo, before God, our lives, our hearts are opened. Well, the ending of this chapter tells us again of the urgent demands of ministry on Jesus and his disciples. The crowd racing to catch up with them, demanding attention, desiring healing, touching the hem of his garment. It's a press, and yet, hopefully, they have recharged from their willingness to retreat to a place of rest. The demands will not cease for them, nor will they cease for us. But practicing Sabbath can allow us, can prepare us for what is to come. Even in short segments, it can reawaken us to the holiness that is all around us. Thanks be to God.